All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you today. We have a really exciting session in store. My name is Deanna Uzarski, and I am on the marketing communications team here at Insight Partners. So today, we are going to be discussing how to build your first executive leadership team and how to do it well. So we brought in some really excellent speakers who have a ton of experience working firsthand with founders and CEOs. So this is part of our ScaleUp CEO series. And this series is focused on sharing foundational knowledge and tactical insights with CEOs and founders and C-suite members from growth and early stage startups. I'm going to go to the next slide. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded. So if you have to leave early or you want to share this with a friend, a colleague, we will send that recording with you. Likely you'll get that next week. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A at the bottom. Please use that to submit questions. Everyone can see those and people can upvote which ones they want to have addressed. We also received a ton of questions in advance from you guys, and we wove those in through our narrative today. And one last thing is there is a survey at the end, it takes about 30 seconds. So we really appreciate if you can fill that out and helps us make sure we're giving you guys the best content possible. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to our moderator today, Blake.
Thank you. I think as we get started here, first I want to thank everybody for attending. But I want to get started here, and we'll start off with just a little bit of an intro of our panelists here before we dive in. So I'll turn it over to you, Owen, first.
Thanks, Blake. Yep. Yeah, it's just Owen O'Toole, in case you're looking at all those vowels, wondering what to do with that, just Owen. It's nice to meet everybody. I am with Riviera Partners, as mentioned. I've been doing early stage executive search for about a dozen years now. I started my own firm about 2014, just to focus on kind of seed through B, so the scale up phase of an organization. Did nothing but that for several years, and then Riviera Partners acquired my company about 2.5 years ago, and so I lead the early stage practice here. Riviera has been around for 22 years now, doing nothing but technology search, so product engine design and the tech stack. We have a machine learning proprietary platform on the back end ourselves that allows us to run an accelerated process, a very impartial and objective process, as well as we're running executive search. But I think between my prior company and Riviera, my combined teams have done about 700 executive searches now for technology leaders in this stage of an organization, this seed through B early scale up stage. So hopefully able to share some patterns with you all today, some hard fought lessons, and point at some walls we've seen run into that can help you steer around. Would be the goal.
Thanks, Owen. How about you, Paige?
Hi, I'm Paige Robinson. I'm the founder of Will Reed. We are a go-to-market executive search firm. Like Owen, very specifically focused on early stage and particularly working with early stage founders. We focus on sales and marketing, customer success, as well as talent and people hires. And I'm just honored to be here. This is a lot of the topics we're going to cover today are absolutely near and dear to my heart. And as Owen said, I think there are a lot of lessons learned when you have done a number of these searches and really help founders kind of get through some of these early stages that, hopefully today will be a very both strategic and tactical conversation. So thank you for having me.
And I'll give a little bit of an overview myself in a second here, but I want to talk about Insight first. And so if you aren't familiar with Insight, we've been investing in software for over 25 years, and we're partners with hundreds of transformative software companies. Really, our mission is to find, fund, and work successfully with executives and provide them with practical hands-on software expertise from their first investment to IPO. And one way we do that is through our on-site team, which is made up of over 100 operators who work very closely with our portfolio. We offer guidance in areas, different areas of expertise, from marketing and sales to product and pricing, and of course, talent. And as for me, I'm a part of that on-site organization where I serve specifically in our Talent Center of Excellence, which is focused on supporting our portfolio companies across the full employee life cycle, from pre-hire, think talent acquisition, to post-hire, everything after employees day one. And my particular area of expertise is executive hiring, which I leverage to support our founders and CEOs across the Insight portfolio. So with that background, let's kind of dive right in. And the first topic we want to talk about today regard some overall trends. And Paige, I'll start with you here, but I'm very curious, what are some of those overall trends that founders are seeing right now as it pertains to the hiring market?
Yeah, I actually love starting with this question because obviously we have been in a market that has, gone up and down and all over the place over the last 3 years. And so interestingly enough, as Owen and I were preparing for this talk, the trends that we actually kind of jointly saw were consistent across technical and go-to-market hiring. And I think gives us a great place to start to understand the moment with which we're going to market to hire these key executives. And I'd say there's kind of 3 key things that we really saw across the board. Is one, the candidate rubric has really changed. So we really are seeing that there is a stronger emphasis on evaluating the leaders in a company for top candidates, both the executives as well as the founder. And I think a lot of that is because, obviously we're in uncertain times. And so, knowing who you're going to kind of be in the trenches with and knowing how they make decisions is becoming a bigger part of their overall criteria. We're also seeing kind of an interesting convergence of the C-suite, both on go-to-market and on the technical side. And so, we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like. And then finally, I think, hybrid work is really here. It's here and not going away. And in fact, we're beginning to really see companies optimize their leadership teams with a hybrid work emphasis, looking for executives that are co-located with the founder, so they have the ability to get together in person periodically and make decisions more quickly. And we have some interesting data that we can share a little bit more about that. And I think that obviously that hybrid work environment shapes a lot of how we think about the hires that we need to attract and win to our company, and the leadership toolkit that they'll need to be effective in that environment. So we'll get into a lot of that today as well. Honestly, Owen, I would love to hear your initial thoughts on the leadership topic. What have you seen in your?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, particularly for early stage companies. Very often, I would say the vast majority of our clients, and yours as well, Paige, are often first-time founders, maybe a second-time founder, right? So you've got the temptation here is to think that I have to have this massive resume of just achievements, and I've been a 3 times founder who's exited, therefore I have the credentials. I don't think that's what it is at all. The expectation is, as a founder, that you're intentional about what you're doing with each of your moves as an organization and with each of your hires. And I think I'd recommend a bit of a kind of step by here for any of the founders and even heads of talent and folks that are on here. And in fact, I think this applies to anybody who's running what's likely to be a leaner org at the earlier stages of their organization, is to build your future state org chart now and be detailed about the job descriptions that fit under each role in that org chart. And it may be that when you've done that, you start putting names next to who's filling those roles, you'll find your name in 4 different spots. And that's okay. I think it's really good to recognize the roles that you're playing. You hear these phrases like wearing many hats, or I'm the jack of all trades, or I catch all of that, or whatever it is. I think you've got to be a lot more intentional about what you are doing and why you're doing it and for how long you can do it. Right. So I think when you've built an org chart that looks like where you'll be, built out the roles that fit under that and are intentional, you can then intentionally put your name or another's name next to each of those. Then I think it's really, really important, especially for any founder out there who's playing the CEO role, write your own job description. What should the CEO of this company be doing, regardless of the fact that you as a founder are playing the CEO role? And again, I think that will allow you to start to get to conviction around how you're filling in pieces around you. So until you really have introspected and looked at what you are and what you are not, and what missing pieces there are in the organization and what's reasonable to ask somebody else to be, I don't think you can even think about bringing an executive on board, right? Otherwise, what happens is, like you say, oh, I don't like doing, or I can't do a lot of the operational parts of the business, I'm going to go hire a COO. And that starts to become management by abdication, not by delegation, right? And you need to be able to frame a role in such a way that it's compelling to the market, that it makes sense to the market. And even if you are going to bolt on another role to it short term, that maybe it has finance and HR in the short term, or there's a couple of areas, you can articulate that in an intentional way that also shows the future executive you're trying to court, where that exit path is, how to evaluate it against your efficacy, their efficacy in their role on an ongoing basis. And then you'll know when the breakpoints are going to start to come. But where the bad example of this, I guess, is just as powerful to articulate is, like I say, I don't like doing these parts of the job, and therefore I'm going to go market to find somebody to do those parts of a job. That's not showing compelling leadership. That's not intentional. And those are the things that get sniffed out really quickly by particularly senior candidates and candidates who've been at startups before, who are looking to mitigate some of the headless chicken stuff that goes on in early stage organizations.
Yeah,
How
I
does
love
that is that in any way dovetail with the second point here, which is this convergence of the C-suite? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Owen or Paige, if you can bolt on to that, but that might be helpful thoughts too.
Honestly, I just love the word intentional. Like, obviously, that was the word that Owen shared quite a bit, kind of in the way to begin to structure how you go to market. And so, I think even as you think about, I would say on the go-to-market side, and I'd love to hear Owen's perspective on the technical side too. On the go-to-market side, we're seeing the convergence of sales and marketing rolling up to a VP of revenue sooner in a company's life cycle than until you get a CRO at a later stage. And I think, kind of again, with intentional being the key word, I think that we've seen that there are really good reasons to do this, and there's some really bad reasons to do this. So like good reasons, I think, is if it, fits your broader like strategic goals to have those functions sit more closely unified, or it increases velocity around, getting to your company's objectives. I think that can make a lot of sense. I think doing it to basically save costs on hiring 2 executives and only hiring 1, or doing it because the candidate that you went out to get, for your VP of sales role is now saying they have to be a VP of revenue or they're not going to join. We've seen that not pan out super well. And so, I think it's an interesting trend and it's an interesting option. But again, I think knowing your why and then being able to communicate to the market that clearly, I think really will resonate with candidates. I'm curious, though, what are you seeing on the technical side?
Yeah, very consistent, certainly in terms of the motivators that should and shouldn't be in place. I think a lot of folks will have heard kind of the adage of, if you have your CTO, who's your technologist, your VP or head of engineering, who's your people and process person, and then your VP or head of product. And historically, we looked at those as 3 legs of a stool and articulated there should be a nice healthy tension between the 3 about what's getting built and why and how fast. If you're going to consolidate into this increasing trend around CTPO, so Chief Technology and Product Officer, you're intentionally going to eliminate that tension. So it ups the bar for me in terms of the seniority of the person you need to look at, and then how you assess some of their skill sets to kind of like self-regulate. How do they bring in checks and balances? How do they bring other voices to the table? How do they bring in, say, for example, even the voice of the customer then becomes this big question. And really then you can't expect these CTPOs necessarily to be masters of all of these trades, right? They're going to have a major, if you like, in their background. And from there, they'll be filling in pieces, and they may have had responsibility for one of the other areas of function, but they won't have been as deep and as tight a leader in there. So you still need that deputy, if you like, beneath them to help the rubber meet the road and be effective and fill in gaps. So it doesn't necessarily solve as much as people would like, but it is, and you think you use the word velocity, right, Paige? I think that's the real driver for this, is decision-making and execution. I've got one neck to choke. We've got, less talking heads in the room. We need to drive to conviction. When we come back and talk about DEI and things like that as we go forward, there's its own kind of downfalls in other areas for this, but nonetheless, it's a trend we're seeing. And I'd say when we did a market survey recently, about 1,100, 1,200 executives in technology, and this was a key trend that was identified more and more. I'm curious, Paige, because you brought it up. I don't know how much of this has been driven from the candidate population, essentially trying to do a grab of scope, and how much has been driven from the client side, but nonetheless, the trend exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think some of it, I think it's coming from both directions. I do think a number of companies are, obviously have been through the last year's been really tough and have had to downsize, and it's trying to figure out like, how do we go back to market and rethink about our leadership team. And, I think this is kind of one of those things that people are considering sooner, kind of sooner in their life cycle because of that.
We've had a couple of really good questions actually come through. One of them that I think is broaching a subject we'll get to later, but I think this might be an opportune time here. But Lori Barlev actually had a question regarding thoughts on hiring leadership part-time, so on a fractional basis, to be able to take advantage of expertise before companies are ready for hiring them full-time. Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I'm a proponent. I think as a startup, so many things are 0 to 1 for you already, but there are also just a ton of solved problems that maybe just you as a founder haven't solved before. So going and leveraging expertise stuff like, your group, right, at Insight is a great example. If you've got investors and you can tap into whether it's advisory work or actual part-time folks that you can go and leverage, they've just seen it all before. You may not need a 5 days a week or 6 days a week hire, but you can leverage, say, a fractional finance leader early, maybe some operational support. There are certain functions, I think, that lend itself better to this. If you can shortcut some 0 to 1 stuff that just doesn't need to be this big lift for the organization. I don't think that I don't think it works in sales, and Paige, you'll have a better perspective. I don't think it works in product, as an example. I think that's where you can certainly tap into advisors, but actual fractional people in the roles, I would recommend against in that function.
I would say with sales, the way I'm seeing it show up is really in a founder-led sales motion. So when it's still primarily the founder that's driving it, I have seen a number of founders tap sales advisors to almost help them begin to more quickly get to pattern recognition around, what is repeatable from what I'm doing versus like, what am I as the founder just able to kind of pull off the shelf and get this thing sold, so that they're almost like preparing the stage for a full-time sales hire. So actually, there's a number of advisors that we work with that come in and help a founder kind of get started. And then they tap us when it's like, okay, now there's a readiness now to bring on a head of sales or VP of sales, because they're transitioning from founder-led sales to that full-time hire. And the idea being that they're kind of at a jump start in terms of like preparing some of that repeatability and some of that playbooking that gives a jump start to a VP of sales being successful when they join. So that's the most common use case that I see. I would say marketing, I most often see marketing as fractional under the VP of marketing, right? So a VP of marketing is going to have a particular major. Typically at the early stage, you're either going to index for product marketing or you're going to index for demand gen or growth. And so kind of that idea of like having a deputy or, some of these more nuanced functions underneath that VP of marketing, you might get someone fractional to cover social media or someone fractional to cover content. But I typically am not seeing you outsource that overall like leadership role that's creating the strategic direction of the function. Once you get to that point where you're ready to hire someone full-time.
Great question, Lori, and appreciate you both answering that. Let's maybe move on quickly. I know we have some data on the hybrid information. We can talk through that. And then I think this is actually going to dovetail really well with the next discussion point, which is that hiring journey and that timeline of those key hires. So if, maybe it makes sense, Paige, if you want to start off with some of the trends you're seeing with hybrid work, and we can take it from there.
Yeah. So, actually, like if you go to that next slide, we did a study, actually, this is kind of as of May of this year, that has a pretty strong representation specifically for seed and Series A. And obviously we're seeing hybrid take up almost 50% of the pie, and then the rest really for the most part going to remote. And I would say, like, tactically speaking, the way that we're seeing this show up is that, and I mentioned this earlier, that people are really looking for executives that can be co-located with the founder, or at least have the ability within reason to get together 1 to 2 days a week, with the idea being like, hey, we can we can kind of get in the same room, work in person through some of those key challenges. But then the rest of the time, obviously, they're still either leading fully remote, or they're leading, still remotely when they're not in person. And so the way I've seen that, at least on the go-to-market side, influence hiring is you have to really think about your leadership team through the perspective of, can they effectively communicate in a remote environment, which sounds easier said than done. Like they have to honestly be able to level up communication to people more senior really effectively, especially early on. If they're one of those key functions, they're preparing communication that you're going to take to your board. So are they good at basically like rolling up information in a way that can be packaged and shared with people more senior? And are they aware enough of being able to communicate things, downstream and at the consistency level that's going to engage culture and, honestly create stickiness within the organization in terms of like direct reports and cross-functionally. And so, I don't know that I'm fully endorsing this, but, I was with another, VC partner recently, and they said they're advising their portfolio to hire one, like a little bit more senior than you would think if you're going to be in a hybrid environment or fully remote, just because of the EQ and overall maturity needed in those candidates. And so, tactically speaking, I think what that can look like in your interview process is that, it's kind of a two-way street, but, don't overlook like signals around how they're communicating with you throughout the process. So the response time, the way that they, honestly, consolidate and communicate next steps. All those are, I think, signals of like how they'll communicate once they're inside the organization, and know that the candidate is also going to be evaluating you on the same thing. So getting back to them quickly and being really, to use our word again, intentional, showcases the kind of leader that you will be when they join your organization. So those are some of the things we're seeing on our end.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And certainly, it certainly is similar to what we see as well in our experience. And I know that you actually had a different lens on this, maybe coming more from the product and technology angle and maybe different types of companies, but what are you seeing in this regard?
Yeah, look, I think this is understood. I think we overlaid this with some data from the candidate population about what their appetites are as well. And nobody's expecting a big uptick in that balance between either remote roles or hybrid, right? So I get the sense, and I'm always have to catch myself when I use the word feel, but that people feel like there's a shift back to on-site. The candidate population is not feeling that, and there's no real appetite for that. I think people have essentially set up lifestyles and such that are conducive to hybrid or remote. I'm seeing more of an appetite for, you've seen this hybrid appetite on the left. People do like it. We're a species that craves this in-person interaction, right? We're not built for these phone box interactions, but so hybrid is becoming more and more acceptable, if you like. But the desire to go back to in-office full-time is still super low, and people have gotten used to not commuting 5 days a week and everything like that. So, there are definitely two sides to the equation. It's A, what the company wants, and B, what the market will tolerate, if you like. And what we're seeing from the data you can see in front of you here is that mix and the appetites for that mix to change and expectations will be pretty consistent, I think, as we move forward. And if you go back a couple of slides, like I just wanted to maybe overlay the impact that, and even one back more that the page is on. Yeah, thank you. That this has is significant on what your attainable funnel of talent is, right? So if you're looking at, and if you're not familiar with the statistical principle of optimal stopping, I suggest get familiar with it as you go to recruit. It will tell you basically out of a sample size of what's attainable to you, how to know that you've seen enough to have conviction. And if, say, hypothetically, you've got 100 people to choose from for the role that you're recruiting for because it's specialized, and you decide that I'm going to be fully in office, you've just shrunk your available population dramatically. So then it affects how you think about your overall pipeline that's attainable for this particular search that you're going to go engage on. Same thing if you decide it's going to be remote, and which version of remote we'll talk about in a second, versus hybrid, and which version of hybrid it is. It has a direct impact on your TAM of candidates, right? Your total attainable market there from a candidate population. And therefore you need to regulate your expectations about how many people you're even going to get to speak to before you need to get to conviction on a hire, like in these types of specialized functions that we're talking about. So,
yeah.
All great discussion points. I want to move on to something that we've kind of talked about a little bit, but I know looking at some advanced questions, it was something that was very important to a lot of people, was this idea of the hiring journey or the timeline. I'm a founder, I'm a CEO, I've got a new company in its early stages. When should I be thinking about hiring people when? I think Lori actually might have had a question about this from the CS perspective. And so, want to start off here and, just ask, what does a typical hiring journey or timeline look like for SaaS startups based upon your experience with working with early stage companies? And I'll turn it over to either one of you on who wants to start that question or start that answer.
Yeah, I think I'll just type back quickly to what I mentioned earlier. If you've built your future state org chart, you know who's filling what roles and what remains vacant and where there's duplication of people in roles. It's a lot easier to have that advanced warning, if you like, about when a role needs a full-time individual in it. And you should be assessing yourself and the org against those gaps on a monthly basis. Startups move too fast. This isn't a quarterly or half-yearly assessment that you're doing. So look, I'll go through kind of the technology arc, and then maybe Paige, you can add the go-to-market overlay to that. And there's a few roles not on here that we should probably just mention because they're very, very specific to your model as to when you hire them, but I'll intrigue them in just a second. But so early on in an organization, particularly a tech, obviously SaaS organization, there's often either a founding CTO, and if there isn't, there needs to be hired a founding CTO. This founding CTO is really a technologist at their core, right? They will and should lay down the architecture for what you're building. be able to put fingers on a keyboard and contribute against that architecture. And then they're going to build the first core team that you have of engineers, maybe 5 to 7 engineers that they can build. And ideally, they're actually pretty strong technologists because they're attracted to another technologist in this role. They're not, in 98% of the cases, the same person who can scale your function of engineering. So as you're breaking that 7 engineer barrier, which is the breakpoint we see very consistently, you need to be looking at your first head of engineering. When that lands depends on your type of organization. It's typically as companies are ticking over late seed into early A, you're still probably somewhere between $500,000 and $3 million in revenue, prior to what we would call product market fit. So you're really not scaling eng yet from say 7 to 50. You're looking at maybe going from 7 to 15, 20 in the next 18 months. And I tend to look at these things in 18-month blocks, generally speaking. So founding CTO is obviously, if you need one, it's because you didn't start with a technologist. They'll get you to 5, 7 engineers. Go look for your first head of engineering to then scale people and process thereafter. After that, and how senior that hire is, we'll entreat in a minute, I think, and kind of what a good profile looks like here. But just thinking about your pace of hiring is really how you dictate the type of person you need in that role. And then look, your engineering and product orgs can stay pretty stable until the next breakpoint that we see is usually about late Series A, or it coincides with revenues typically in that kind of 6 to 10 million. So you've gone 0 to 1, you got it out of the gates with your core team. You've gone 1 to 3, which can still be sometimes just brute forced, and it doesn't mean you've got product market fit. But when you're going 3 to 10, you're needing to lay down the repeatable, scalable motions of all of your functions. But usually as a founder, you're still the product head. You're the founder, the vision holder, the product strategist. At late A, getting 6 to 10 million, you need to be a full-time CEO, right? And so that's when we start to see this first VP or head of product come in really for the first time. Rarely is it a CPO, it's worth noting as well. What I didn't touch on in there, like I say, there are things like COO or VP operations. Again, depends on your skill set as a founder, how much of that you can take for how long. Finance, similarly, depends on the complexities of your business. Again, there are partial solutions available really through kind of most of C, certainly seed and most of A, without those types of full-time heads in place very often. So just there's a lot of nuance there that dictates whether they're hired in this window or not, but the build it and sell it stuff are consistent every time.
Paige, what about the perspective from the go-to-market side?
Yeah, so the job of being a founder is tough because you're kind of all the roles for a long time. But obviously you kind of see as you scale, you're able to bring on more and more aspects where you're taking off different parts of the go-to-market function and handing it off to other people. Typically, we see the first kind of go-to-market hire typically happen roughly 1 million in ARR. I would say I think it's worth caveating across all of this. This is not a one size fits all. This is like, hey, this is a pattern that we see most common. And there are good reasons to break with this pattern that, you as a founder are going to have to get conviction around and have, you'll know your business better than anybody. You can work on that with your investors. So I don't want you to read this as too prescriptive. It's just more around like pattern recognition that both Owen and I have from working on a lot of searches. So typically, sales is typically led by a founder to about 1 million ARR. And then at that point, you're typically seeing a founder look to either bring on, I would say 2 AEs or a head of sales. And, I've seen both work. The benefits of hiring 2 AEs is that you typically get, 2 people that you can kind of compare and contrast. There's a lot of velocity around onboarding. And, a lot of times I'll see clients, pick AEs with a bit of a different skill set. So you can kind of compare them against one another. That said, for what it's worth, I will say that I do see most often our founders hire typically, that are second-time founders hire a head of sales first rather than going for 2 AEs. And I think a big part of that is if you can find a head of sales that can bat down and are comfortable basically being that AE for the first 3 to 6 months, the founder ultimately gets leverage faster, right? So if you have somebody that can come alongside you, kind of be that deal closer, begin starting to build some, playbooking and repeatability, and then can also be the same person that, gets you to 5 to 10 AEs. I mean, that's a huge pickup. And yeah, I saw the question in the comment. AE is account executive. So it's kind of your first individual contributor as a seller. So if you go with the first AE, starting with AEs, we typically see the head of sales, come on around the Series A, and shortly followed by marketing. That's kind of helping build out the overall like marketing, I would say marketing department, and typically around product marketing to help, a company really communicate who they are to the world and to customers. And if you do these hires in this order, you typically have what you need if you hired well until you're really moving out of Series A, beginning of Series B, where oftentimes those like kind of scrappy doers that can kind of get in there and figure it out are not necessarily the same leaders that are going to scale you to that next revenue inflection point. And so a lot of times you'll see another set of leaders come in late Series A, Series B, they're kind of at that VP level, that are going to take you to the next point in the journey.
Yeah, some of the distinctions here, and I think they're consistent with sales, marketing, product, etc. At this early stage, you're looking at hiring a team builder. As you get late A into B, you're looking at hiring an org builder, and then later on it's an org scaler. So if you keep those kind of frames of reference in mind, I think it helps temper your expectations about what you're getting from an individual in these early stage roles. Rarely do you need to go grab an org scaler and pull them into an early stage organization, and very rarely are they effective, right? So thinking about team builder, org scaler is kind of three distinct personas, if you like, out there. That mental framework might help as you're thinking about any of these individual hires.
So you've gotten to the point, right, where you've identified that you need to make a hire, right? You can kind of feel it. The org is shifting and changing in ways that you're starting to pick up on. But like, how does a founder actually know it's time to get serious and actively recruit for an executive?
Yeah, look, I think again, if we can, first of all, it's planning, and we all know startups, and then the earlier stages, planning is hard. But insofar as you can look into the looking glass and think about your future state org, and not be reactive about what hires you're going to need when. Obviously, we all go and raise funds and throw a pitch deck out there that says, I need the money to do this. And I don't know how well those plans are often followed through, but the more you can understand and assess consistently who's doing what jobs and to what level of efficacy, the quicker you're going to get that signal about, I need to go to market. I think there's two other key factors for me here, right? One is, typically speaking, early stage, your first 1 to 10 employees come from your network. The next 10 come from their network. And after that, you need to find a way to extrapolate that and make it into a bigger thing. First of all, from a DEI perspective, if nothing else, if you're going to who and what you already know, there's a chance of homogeneity there, and then only their networks, it's going to kind of perpetuate that problem. And if you've laid that foundation early for kind of homogeneous networks, you're going to perpetuate that through the company's life cycle. We've seen that very consistently. It's harder to kind of reverse track. So the reason to kind of think about going and making a new executive hire from the outside early as well can have impacts on the entire DEI DNA of your organization for years following. And then second, I think, like I say, it's about breaking up your 0 to 1 problems, right? If what you're building is brand new, which is not a case for a lot of startups, like brand new to the world, then you can bring in a team that can problem solve with you. Most of us are building a new business model, a new approach, attacking a new market. So there are so many solved problems for you already that if you're looking and staring down the barrel of something that is foreign to you as a founder, but we know is a solved problem in the world, I think that's a great time to think, okay, I should just bring in a seasoned executive who knows how to do this and shortcut so much. Again, my probably biggest frustration in Silicon Valley is getting on calls with founder after founder who are solving problems that are very similar to one another, next door to one another, and they've been solved repeatedly for the last 5 and 10 years over and over. And it's just go ask for that help, right? Leverage your investors if you can, folks like the Insight team, talking to advisors, talking to friends of friends, anybody you can to say, okay, hey, here's the problem statement I'm looking at. Is this solved in the world? If so, where? And then you can go get somebody who's seen this before and again, shortcut that new 0 to 1 journey that just doesn't need to happen,
I want to kind of get a little bit more tactical on this now too, right? So I think there are always a lot of questions around like, what does my ideal hire look like? What is an archetype for the role, right? And Paige, maybe we can start off with you and maybe sales and or marketing, but like, what is that typical first-time sales hire look like? What should a founder be looking at in terms of the profile characteristics?
Yeah, great question. We have seen a lot of success with our clients of really targeting kind of that senior director level. Typically, they have been a part of another high growth company, but they haven't run the whole thing. So they've learned under a great leader. They've been kind of that deputy under a great sales leader, and so they have seen early stage success, but again, not been the one person responsible for it. So I think it tends to be that paired with, I would say, some clear like DNA around really kind of that entrepreneurial early stage aptitude that honestly is harder to 100% get on paper, but you have to get out in your interview process. That is like one of the single most important aspects to ascertain while you're interviewing someone, just because, none of the systems are going to be there. They're going to be walking in on day one. And it's like, maybe you've set up Salesforce, good on you, but a lot of times they haven't, right? So setting up the systems, they don't have a sales ops person there yet. So are they comfortable figuring that out? And by the way, we got to figure out, how we don't have any of our data in the right places to understand our sales motion. So are you able to figure that out, right? So I would say another key piece to look for is, can this person explain to you and demonstrate that they've been a problem solver and that they have the tenacity and energy to do so? And so a lot of times the way, like I've seen, some of our most successful like placements, when you go back and kind of look at pattern recognition, in addition to kind of that deputy role, I would say we also have seen, one, have they had a clear early stage stop where they have, really been at a company early, or maybe they were even a founder themselves, for even like a lifestyle business, where they stepped into that. And I would also say we've had a lot of success with like past consultants that have then layered that with early stage experience and have made that transition. I would be weary of things I'd be weary of is like the 3 or 4 time, really senior VP coming back and doing this all over again, where they have no systems, no support, no nothing. Oftentimes that is a bigger shock to the system than candidates appreciate. Some people can do it, but I think that more often than not can be a miss in expectations with what the candidate is expecting out of the role on day one. And I think marketing, this one is worth covering, just because I think marketing is one that I think can easily go off the rails, candidly, at the early stage. If you're hiring your first marketer and kind of bringing that head of marketing, you need everything, right? Maybe your website's okay, but you kind of need a facelift there. You're really not sure, how to drive MQLs. You're not sure if your language is right that you're using with the world. Maybe you need an event strategy, right? Like you have all the things that are there. So I think one of the kind of going back to Owen's comment on planning, I think planning and understanding kind of like, hey, what are all the different things that we think we need and what needs to happen first, and let that drive how you're thinking about the major and the minors with that head of marketing, because they're not going to be good at everything. I mean, a marketer is kind of like almost like a developer in the sense that they have several skill sets they're going to be really good at. And then they're really honestly probably going to be not that experienced in some of these other things. And so what we see most often is that first marketer tends to be a product marketer who has, come up through product marketing and, has deep expertise again in an early stage environment. I would look for, if you are a company that sells to a more technical audience, obviously a lot of, being successful with a new hire is what is that ramp time for them to get up to speed. That's one where I think having specific like customer persona experience is pretty important because it cuts down the ramp time for that marketer. So if they have marketed to developers in the past, I would really look for that in terms of your ideal candidate profile as you go to market. And when I say major, just to kind of say that specifically, I would major on things like, head of product marketing or demand gen or growth or content, pick one, maybe two that you need someone to specialize in, and recognize that the other piece of it is that early stage DNA. That's the piece where they're either going to work really hard to figure it out for a time and kind of hold it together. And then they're going to be the right person that's going to come to you and say, hey, I need a part-time, specialist in this area to augment my skill set, or we're ready to hire a full-time content person. And they're going to begin to build the team around them to offset where they're weaker on some of these other disciplines of marketing.
And I think with marketing too, right? The product marketing is probably the least commoditized and commoditizable skill set that there is. I think there are aspects of demand gen and growth increasingly these days that are automated. There are agencies there are things you can do, but those functions, sub-functions of marketing can exist and operate in a vacuum, right? And the overall company positioning and messaging is essential. And I think founders will often misconstrue product marketing when you talk about positioning and messaging as like brand, and it's very much not that, right? It's the world in which your company exists or doesn't exist. Only inside of that world can you run effective campaigns and test and iterate and reach and do demand gen operations. So I think that's, and I used to do go-to-market search a long time ago, so I might be outdated here, Paige, but consistently, I think that's why we say product marketing over demand gen as the major for your head of marketing.
Also, everything else is built off of it, right? Like if you don't have your product marketing like North Star, it's hard to build effective campaigns. It's hard to build, an effective sales, motion around it. Like you have to know who you are first and how you're going to explain it to the world.
Yeah. Sorry, Blake.
Very helpful perspective, Paige. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Owen, to give more of the product and engineering side. And we actually have a question that came in about going about hiring a CTO. So it's quite timely, but would love to get your perspective on what that looks like for your types of hires.
Yeah. And look, we do a bunch of, I'll call them kind of founder marriages for these first CTOs. So certainly happy to talk to that as well, specifically in the question. But this early stage CTO hire, there can be a hesitance to call them that because it's not what most of us picture when we think CTO as this like industry leader. That happens much later. Like your Series C-ish, you need an industry leader, all singing, all dancing CTO. This is a very different version, but with the same title. So these first CTOs are either a senior engineer or an architect. They're really individual contributors and folks who typically come up the individual contributor track, who can think about. I think the key differentiator for me in separating the market here from the sea of individual contributors that exist and those that can play an early stage CTO role is really about understanding, can they wrap their technical decision making in business context, right? Because there are a lot of 0 to 1 CTO types who love playing with new technology and who can tinker, or will just want to build a tech stack based on the coolest, newest thing that's out there. And then there are those that understand this needs to be proprietary because we need to have, this is part of our IP that makes us valuable as an organization. If we can have this data set housed and owned and operated or grown by us versus this infrastructure piece is very commoditizable. They're looking at cost bases for all of those types of decisions. They're looking at scalability. So they're very much a technologist at the core. The engineers that you hire then obviously completely dependent on the type of org you're at. But where, like I mentioned earlier, where the break happens then is, and where we want to talk about mistakes that we see founders make or try to make is, I need that technologist who can scale my org. They're very rarely the same person. And the reason being, those tracks deviate pretty early on the engineering tree, right? As an IC engineer, I can keep going up the kind of tech lead architecture track pretty early, or, principal staff engineer, or I can go team lead, manager, senior manager, director. Each one of those on this side takes me one layer abstracted from the code every time I step up, right? And so finding somebody who really can straddle it's a rare bird. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's a very rare bird, and you need to know, if you're asking for it, that you're again eliminating massive swaths of the population, and it's going to have a time penalty for you as you go to market to look for talent. So the VP or head of engineering that you'll hire then is your people and process. So the three legs of this stool are tech, people, process. Tech is your CTO, your head of eng is people and process. And who you hire and how senior you hire is dictated by your pace of growth, as I mentioned earlier. So if I'm at this 7, maybe 10 engineers, it's starting to break, my CTO is starting to break, I need to go from 7 to 20 in the next 18 months, you're going to go grab probably a first line manager, maybe a director from a high growth startup, maybe a Series C/D company, similar to Paige's patterns of they've seen it, but they haven't led it. And they're ready to kind of go put a stamp on what engineering looks like under their guys. To be careful to vet for there is, are they copying and pasting what they've seen work, or are they able to apply critical thought to what they saw work and how they would change in terms of processes and scale, etc. That person needs to show you they can recruit. That's probably 60% of this job is bringing in the next 10, 14 engineers. That's nearly a full-time job. That's 60% of it. 20% of this job is down and in within the org, right? And unlocking and unblocking the engineers, doing code review, maybe doing architecture review, really being the level of accountability with the org. And then 20% of this role is, let's call it across and up and out potentially for the organization. So being an executive, being in those decision-making meetings. So that's how you need to vet these people. I don't know many founders who, when they bring us an initial interview plan, have baked in assessing how they hire, who they've hired, how many, how fast, what those people have gone on to do. Are they a leader who create leaders? Are they, typically always hire very junior? Was that consistent with where they needed to be? So there's a lot that you need to unpack with who these individuals hire. So that's the core early hires. If you're going 10 to 50 engineers in a hurry, you're just going one more level upstream because you need, maybe it's a director, senior director, or a VP at that high growth company, because they need to have followership, because they need to probably bring the first 10 engineers out of the gates. And they're going to have a developed recruiting processes for their organization, not just made hires, right? So there's some nuance there based on the pace of growth you're going through. The only other role really, like I said, in this early spectrum, this VP product, the rub here, so like marketing, I would say the exact same thing for product. Have they built for this audience before? That's the lens that I start and look at product through, right? And if they've built for this audience before, then I don't necessarily need to worry too much about, do they know exactly what my product is, as much as I do that they know how to build for and speak to this audience, and they can kind of look at product through that lens, and my buyer ultimately. So at that late A, like I said, you're needing to become a full-time CEO as the vision and product strategy holder. You need to have a good long look in the mirror about your readiness to relinquish some of the control here. What's been black and white to you before now needs to start to take shades of gray under somebody else's vision. And where we find a rub is if you go fetch a director of product from the market, they want to increase their scope, and they'll be okay executing like an individual contributor PM, and they're doing product requirement documents, and they're picking up the phone and talking to customers, and they're doing what's needed there. But they want to start grabbing strategy. And I think there's product strategy and there's company strategy. And only at late A, as a founder, do most founders realize those two things need to become disambiguated. They've been so intermeshed at that stage that company strategy and product strategy are one and the same. Now you need to be able to separate company strategy and spend your time there and let this person really own product strategy. And that's going to get you the altitude of leader that most founders we talk to want, which is somebody who can challenge them about what you're doing and why, and who's bringing that customer voice to the table. That's the difference. I think when it goes wrong here is the want to hold on to all of that for too long as a founder, and then you end up hiring somebody too junior. You're having to be too directive with them, and really what you've hired is a project manager and not a senior product leader, right? So just that word of warning, I think, for that particular hire.
There's a lot of nuance here, right? As you can tell, there's a lot to unpack here. You could spend a lot of time talking through these different profiles. I think we've talked about it a little bit. You've mentioned vetting, right? We've talked a little bit about what that can look like. Let's move into that and address it formally, right? And that executive hiring process. And the question I would ask here, and Paige, we can maybe start with you if you're comfortable, is like, you've identified that you need to hire a member of this leadership team, right? They've started to think about what that process can look like. Like, how do you design an ideal sort of candidate interview process? And then I think as part of that as well, like, what are some of those best practices when you're starting to look at making one of these hires?
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly think it's best to, a lot of times we like, okay, we need to hire someone. Let's jump right into getting into market and starting to talk to candidates. And in a way, I think it goes better if you almost give yourself 2 to 3 weeks to prep and like double down on your conviction around the role, and around what you're trying to solve for in the hire. Because again, thinking all the way back to the top of the call, being able to clearly communicate that and clearly communicate it with intentionality to a candidate is going to make it really attractive to that candidate in the interview process. And it's going to make sure that you focus your time in the right way. And so, what I would say is whether you use a firm or not, I think you need to kind of understand that this process often takes about 3 months end to end. And it can take longer, it can go shorter, but that's kind of a rough estimate. In the prep, in that prep area, things that we like to coach founders on is, leverage your network at that stage. Leverage your network, tap your VC, talk to people, talk to a number of candidates that are kind of in the market, and use that as a way to validate your reason for hiring and validate your timing around that hiring, validate the title, validate compensation, validate, how you scope the role. I tend to see that those conversations work best once you have what I call like an ideal candidate, like profile worksheet, where you've really communicated, like clearly outlined to yourself, this is what I'm solving for. Here are the core competencies I think this person needs, both hard and soft. And then here are the ways that I'll actually know whether or not this person was successful, right? It can be very back of the napkin, but if you kind of have like a thesis around that, and then you take those into 5 or 6 networking calls where you're validating it, you'll begin to find yourself fine-tuning that document. And that document really is upstream from a job description, right? So you kind of get your thesis for the role. Once you've validated that, then you're able to, essentially build out a robust, job description that is really, you should think of it as more as like, that's marketing collateral. That's not really for you. That's for candidates, to get candidates interested in the role. And so thinking about ways that, that's going to present well in the market. The other thing that I think at the prep stage is really important is to identify who is going to be a part of this hiring panel and what role are you asking them to be. So things that absolutely kill an interview process is to have too many drivers or too many deciders and too many steps. And so it's really important to kind of evaluate, say, okay, who is the driver of this process in terms of making the decision and championing the candidate? Who is going to support me from an administrative perspective, or is that going to be done on my end? Obviously, if you use a firm will be that administrative driver as well for you. And then really determine who are the contributors, and contributors they're contributors. They're not the decider. You're using them for, to look at a candidate to give you additional data points, but you can't confuse the two, or else you're going to like rule by committee and you're not going to get to a hire in an optimal amount of time. 2 call outs on prep, just for things to kind of think about. 1, the prep is a really good time to get conviction on, is this a hire that I'm going to self-source, or is this a hire where I'm going to use a firm? And I think a way to think about that, and Owen and I talked about this even in preparation for this call, and I agree with him, is just that it's really like being honest with yourself about your own network and your own ability to assess and draw talent from that network. So if you're a very technical, CEO and you've hired for this role, 2 or 3 times in a past life, then maybe you feel like you've got the network and you can build a short list and get that done quickly. But if you know nothing about marketing, or nothing about sales, and you don't really know anybody, like that's where probably it'd be best to use a firm, because what often happens is if you self-source, you run through this entire 3-month process, you don't get a successful hire, and you have to start back at the beginning. And so be clear about your choice. Choose one or the other and have good reason for why you're doing it, so that you run it in an optimal time frame. The second thing I would call out on prep is that this is also a really, really important step around really building a diverse workforce. And the reason being is that, how you go to market with the role, if this is something, that you're thinking about building out your team and being really intentional in that way, you're going to, think about the firm you use differently. If you go with a firm, if you go on your own, you're going to think about the different channel sources that you want to go to attract candidates. You need to be really mindful about the way your job description is written. You need to be clear in expectations around how you're thinking about the overall funnel and candidate pool that you're going to be expecting to get. And I think also you have to have a clear understanding of the total market size, because kind of going back to something Owen said earlier is like, okay, if I'm looking for, and I'll use in my world, an amazing female VP of enterprise sales. Love those women, worked with many of them, placed many of them. We're a small and mighty bunch, but there's not a lot of them. So your expectation that you're going to talk to 20 of them to get to your hire is totally unrealistic. This is a sharpshooter search, and you may get 5 or 6. They're also the most sought after, one of the most sought after profiles in the industry. And so you need to know that you're competing with 6 or 7 other companies to earn the right for her to come to your company. And so you need to be thinking about that in terms of the pacing of your interview process, the woo that you put into it. And so a lot of that, I think, done well, happens at that prep phase before you ever go to market. I'm cognizant of time. Owen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these other stages as well.
Yeah, no, look, I'd echo that in terms of diversity. Your top of funnel is what you can optimize for. Your outcome you cannot, but you really have to optimize your top of funnel outreach to a diverse population. And if you're, again, don't have a super diverse personal network, then you need to find a way to manufacture that, if you like, whether through your investors, through a search firm or otherwise, to find pockets that you don't otherwise have access to directly. But the time penalty, you want to underscore that you just mentioned. Doing it yourself is fine. If you don't have a result after 3 months, you're still starting a new 3-month journey if you go and use an executive search firm, because they'll need to go through this process. In terms of the kickoff, interviews, etc., as you go through here, my general rule of thumb, if you've interviewed more than 7 people, something's probably not right, right? You're not getting who you want because you're not targeting the right people, or you're targeting the right people and they don't want you. So your storytelling could be off, or you're just trying to hire out of sequence, like we talked about earlier, maybe somebody too big or too small for the role. But if you've gone past 7, I would just tell yourself to stop and reassess. I've talked to founders who've talked to literally tens of people. I'm like, it's insanity, right? There's not enough good data you can glean from that. Get a bullseye, know what it looks like, get conviction on that early and go after it hard, right? There's no point in compromising down early and just diluting your population. There's too much nuance in all of these roles for there to be just a mass population of folks out there who can do it, right? Then during your interview process, you've got to manage a candidate experience end to end within a 3-week time frame. We've had a lot of leakage in our pipelines of late of candidates who will bail because their processes are taking 2 months, right, or 3 months, and there's big lags of communication. Paige mentioned earlier, leadership matters, and the rubric that candidates are assessing us through matters. If our communication isn't tight, if we're not sending wrap-ups and recaps of interviews we've had with the candidate to that candidate and next steps within a 24-hour period and scheduling and moving along, they're judging us on our behavior as founders, that we don't have our communications together to run a remote or hybrid company, that we're not paying attention to detail, we don't have good follow-up. So we're being assessed all the way through here as well. And candidates also want to feel special, so having that momentum in a process matters. Realistically, how this works, because I know we had a lot of questions on this timeline. 3 weeks is behind the scenes, and you're talking to subject matter experts, you're getting your input. 1 week is preparing the organization to go to market. And then after that, when you go to market, you should have a cohort of folks that you've approached. You should get 3 to 5 people out of that initial cohort that are really spot on, who want to talk to you. After that, you're looking at probably 1 a week is your cadence you can expect, because you have by now set a bar that you're looking to exceed. And so you don't get to have the luxury of wasting that first cohort and doing another batch of 5 and another batch of 5. You're just getting dilutive every time you do so. So should be 3 to 5, and then you're adding maybe 1 person a week who we think could beat the best of what we've seen so far. And you should be able to have conviction. All the more reason to be really tight upfront about what you're going to market for. If you go out loosey-goosey, you're going to have 20 interviews and be none the wiser about what you really need, right? So, and then the offer process, we can spend a bit of time on. I think we've got a couple minutes, but that's that bulk of the interview process. The main thing is thinking about your talent brand during that time frame. The only other point I wanted to make here was about hybrid. Most companies who are running hybrid want to do an interview process that's multiple Zooms, and then they bring the candidate on site for the presentation round, whatever that might look like. It's a whiteboarding session, it's a presentation of previous work done, it's a problem, whatever it is. I would suggest flipping that. It's much easier to impress in the room than it is to impress over Zoom. And there are times where your hire, your executive, whoever it is in a hybrid environment, are going to need to interview and influence your organization or your clients over Zoom. And I would sooner pressure test that here than necessarily in the room. Or if you can do both, great, without being too onerous on the candidate in terms of expectations, but being really thoughtful about the skills they need to be able to perform. How are you assessing those throughout the interview process? And that's a key one. Yeah.
Fantastic. I know we're just about at time, and we could spend a lot more time on this, but I want to thank both of you for this really engaging discussion. I think there's a lot of information here that hopefully is really helpful to our audience. And so with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Deanna and kind of let her wrap things up.